Now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Leslie M. Harris, Professor of History at Northwestern University, and this year, the 2022-23 David L. Wagner Distinguished Fellow at the Newberry Library. Leslie Harris has co-authored or authored 5 books, including the award-winning In the Shadow of Slavery, African Americans in New York City in 2003, and most recently, Slavery and the University, Histories and Legacies in 2019 with James T. Campbell and Alfred L. Brophy. Dr. Harris has also participated in a number of public history projects, including the award-winning Slavery in New York exhibition at the New York Historical Society, the reinterpretation of the urban slave quarters at the Telfair Museum's Owens Thomas House in Savannah, Georgia, which included an edited volume, Slavery and Freedom in Savannah, that she co-edited with Dinah Ramey Berry, and the interactive website People Not Property with Historic Hudson Valley. Leslie M. Harris's work has also been supported by the Harvard Radcliffe Institute, the Mellon and Ford Foundations, the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, the Institute for Historical Studies at the University of Texas, and the University of Maryland. This year, as the inaugural holder of the David L. Wagner Distinguished Fellowship and Lectureship for Humanistic Inquiry at the Newberry Library, Professor Harris is currently writing a book called Leaving New Orleans, A Personal Urban History. This book combines memoir with family, urban, and environmental histories to explore the multiple meanings of New Orleans from its founding through its uncertain future amid climate change. Again, we at the Newberry are so grateful to David L. Wagner and Renie B. Adams for making this fellowship possible that brought Leslie M. Harris here this year. So thank you for joining us this evening for this conversation. It's great to be here.
Thank you so much for having me, and I too am extraordinarily grateful.
So one of the things, I think one of the misconceptions about the Newberry when among academics, genealogists, the general public, is they hear that we have these collections of local history, and they might think, oh, it's a place to study Chicago, right? Local history of Chicago. But you're here studying New Orleans, right? And we actually have a deep collection of local histories for multiple localities. And I think we've got some images that you would like to show that just give a sense of what you found related to New Orleans in the Newberry collection. So maybe we can start there.
Sure, absolutely. I was very surprised to see the things that you did have in the collection. I did have the question of how I would spend a year here working on New Orleans, and I want to say that in addition to the primary sources that are going to scroll through, there are also a lot of secondary sources. So the context that I very much need to put my family in, I'm able to do a lot of that work here, either through books that you own, and there's also ways that I can order books through the Newberry. So it's actually a wonderful place for me. So here is a map from, I think it's from the 1730s. So this is one of the earliest pieces I've found so far. It's also a visual piece. So I was looking for something that would be visually interesting. There will be a few other things that you'll see, and these will scroll through a couple of times. There's another, this is a English and French document by Governor Claiborne, who is trying to convince actually the Americans to allow there to be a militia in Louisiana. So I was kind of shocked to see. And that was his original signature on the reverse. And this is the French version. So this is one document. And then, oh, there's a fantasy postcard coming up. A fantasy postcard about a city that many people have fantasies about. Here it is. I'm not sure what the fantastic part is. It must be that they're in that balloon, which I think you can get into balloons. I don't know why it's a fantasy, but maybe I'll figure out more about it. And this is from 1908, if I remember correctly. And then the final piece you'll see is this. This is a video. I think it's the Dorothy Hild, H-I-L-D collection. She has a number of videos, but some are called personal, and this is a personal New Orleans and Miami. This is her vacation video. And so this is from the 40s, and as I was looking at it, I was like, gosh, it looks very familiar, even though it's from the 40s. There are things, you'll see that that's a banana plant, by the way. There are cars and things that indicate that it's old, but it's in the French Quarter, which has this way of looking the same. This woman is fascinating to me. I don't know who she is. Anyway, so you can watch these on a loop, but more broadly, I just want to say that, it really revealed to me that the Newberry has, materials that are about local places. It's a place to do local history, no matter where you're from, so.
Thanks, Leslie. Thanks for pulling those together. These we'll loop this a few times during the program so that you can listen to us and watch the video as well. These are all also available freely to the public through the Newberry's website, and if you follow the link to digital collections. So to get to your work, tell us about the decision at this point in your career to write about your own family.
Well, it was definitely a decision. It was a turning point. It grew out of the 2005 hurricane season, that Hurricane Katrina, the experience. I'm a native of New Orleans. Much of my family was still in the city when the hurricane struck. They had evacuated. My immediate family had evacuated, and just that experience of watching this place that you thought you knew and then seeing it through the eyes of others was profoundly upsetting. It was disturbing. It was to hear people make judgments, pass judgments on people who lived there, make arguments about what should happen to New Orleans. It was a profoundly disorienting time. And I also watched people begin to write about New Orleans, and I didn't, of course, always agree with everything that was being written. So I began to think about how I wanted to approach this as an historian. And I am a 19th century historian. I usually like talking to dead people, not living people. But I definitely began with this idea of using what happened in Katrina as a way to talk about the history of the city, using my own experience and my family's experience as well. And I will say that pretty early on, I realized that I was stepping into a tradition, an African-American tradition, where we often feel that in order to prove ourselves as citizens, we have to rehumanize ourselves. We have to not just be what's discussed in the paper, not just what's on TV, but we have to say, wait a second, remember, these are real people, these are real families. And that goes all the way back for me to the anti-slavery movement. The fugitive slave narratives existed so that people would know that these enslaved people were people like all of us, that they had families, that they had children, they had parents, and that they were being harmed by the system. That's very much been a part of a human rights campaign. And of course, other groups of people also have had to do that. So I felt like in that sense, I had some models for how do you contextualize a life. There are also some more contemporary things. Saidiya Hartman's book, To Lose Your Mother, was an amazing work that combines history and her personal experience of understanding slavery and African Americans. There have been historians who have done this work before, so I began to look for it. And now there are many more of us, I think, who are doing this kind of work.
Can you give us a sense of the narrative arc of your family's history? How far back are you able to find your family in New Orleans? Where had they come from? And then I'm also curious, how much are you a character in this story? Are you going to write this story? Even if you tell us today the chronology of your family in New Orleans, do you think you'll write the history in a chronological way as well?
So it's not a chronological story, but I'm very much a character in it because I was born the year of Hurricane Betsy, which is 1965, and was the largest storm, I would say, prior to Katrina, with the kind of massive change in the city. So that arc of 65 to 2005 was where I started. Like what was going on? How did the promise of civil rights, how was that combined with an understanding that the federal government was going to be able to build levees that would survive a storm. So that promise, that moment, that post-World War II moment of promise, and certainly my own life in the 70s, in high school, in terms of education, in terms of what we were trying to achieve as a family. My parents were among the first in their families to gain a college education, so we were going to be second generation. All of that was part of this optimism, even in a city that, I don't know if we knew it at the time, would eventually fail. By the 80s, because of a lot of things, but white flight, middle class flight, the oil crisis, and the turn to tourism, all of these things would gradually mean an economic problem in the city, and the city, I think, is still dealing with that. So in that sense, I was always part of that. What happens, were we an upwardly mobile family in a downwardly mobile city was how I described that. I initially didn't think that I would find out much more about my family earlier, and particularly my father's family. My mother had done some research on her family back into the 19th century, but my father's family, I didn't think we would find out much information about him. So for me, this was a way to equal out those two stories as well, their stories. But then as I began to do research, I found out more about my father's family even earlier. So I now can go back to about 1800 with my father's family. I'll be trying to figure out if I can do the same with my mother's family. My father, it turns out, is descendant of someone who was well known in New Orleans, a man named Jordan Noble, who was called the drummer boy of the Battle of Orleans. He marched with Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson knew him. He was about 15 at the time, but he continued to have a life in New Orleans until his death in 1890. So we think, he states that he was born in 1800. He and his mother were brought from Georgia to Louisiana, and then he lived in New Orleans until 1890. So that was a complete, shocking surprise. And I really owe that, I'm going to say, the person I owe that to is my young cousin, Alex Traps Chavala, who, when I met him, was the youngest certified genealogist in the state of California at the age of 18, who had been researching from the age of 13 in the Mormon archives in California. So I just want to say that that was not my find.
We need to come back to him because that's he's a fascinating character in your work as well. But Noble is just one of many surprises, right? That you. So I'm curious if you can share some of the surprises that you have found out in this research project, and then also to let us know kind of how it shapes your work.
Right. So one of the things with Noble and with his family and with my father's family and my mother's family, so when I was growing up, I knew that my mother's family were Creoles and my father's family were not. But then I learned that one of my Jordan Noble's grandchildren kind of rejected his, that kind of identity, a mixed race identity, an elite identity in the early 20th century, and kind of turned her back on that. She could have been Creole, because her mother was a French speaker, was a woman from Haiti. They met, her grandmother, excuse me. So there was that kind of French ancestral line. But she really said, nope, we're Black, this family is Black, and my grandfather's descendant of that. So just hearing about that story, which I got from a cousin who was about 100 years old when I interviewed her, who remembered back into that time period, was profound and incredible. It was incredible to meet with someone who had that length of memory and that connection to the past.
So do you think was this family lore? Is it family secrets? Have you thought about the relationship? I mean, sometimes things get passed down in families that just don't happen to be correct, but there's nothing, there's no effort behind, trying to hide something. But as you've learned about your own family, have you thought about family lore and family secrets? Or
the interesting thing about Jordan Noble is that Alex and I took the information about Jordan Noble to this cousin, and she had never heard of him, didn't recognize him. There's one photograph that's actually in the Historic New Orleans collection. So for me, it's this question. So usually you would think of people hiding something shameful.
Right.
And here is someone who was incredibly famous, well-known. He's talked about in the New Orleans newspapers throughout his life. And he disappears from my part of the family. So it kind of turns that on its head. But it just raises this question of when and why do stories drop out of families, and how can we recover them? It's difficult. I just was reading about someone today. I can't remember who it is, but she's in my head because she said that her uncle and father, I think it was in the New York Times today, her uncle and father were researching and had all of this material they'd gathered on a situation in their family, but no one can find the boxes. That's like, oh, that's always the family story, but it's also the historian's story often in the archives, that you go to that place in the catalog where something should be and it's not there, and there's not a card, and it's.
Well, I mean, you've done so much work as a public historian, right? Which in a way is thinking about, what do we remember, right? What do we choose to remember collectively? How do we choose to mark or write about or memorialize? But we talk less about how we forget, right? And this is a really interesting story, I guess, of, would you agree with that it's a kind of a process of forgetting in your family about Noble?
Yeah, it's a process of forgetting. I mean, I don't know yet. How important is Jordan Noble past his death in 1890? I mean, 1890 is, it's been called the nadir of African American history. It's the rise of lynching. It's the beginning of segregation, which will be ruled yes, but separate but equal in the Supreme Court. Plessy versus Ferguson is in New Orleans. I mean, what looks famous and amazing then, during his lifetime maybe, and maybe now, in that moment when that family is trying to survive this new racial regime, who cares? To be honest, it doesn't affect them. It doesn't help them, it seems.
Right. So you talked about sitting down and interviewing a family member who's 100 years old. So as academic historians, we would talk about doing oral history, right? And the challenges of dealing with what level of skepticism do you bring to oral history, and the faulty memory and all that. But I guess my question for you is, as an academic historian, does it feel different? Is it something different to just sit down with an ancestor in your family and just talk about your family? Is there a difference between sitting down and talking about your family and doing oral history?
There's a little bit of a difference. I mean, this ancestor, Agnes, I had never met her before. So it was almost like meeting someone that I would do, as a professional historian, would do oral history with. I did also interview my father, and that felt a little more personal, but even there I found out things that I didn't know. Like, I had a list of questions and I asked them, and in asking them, it was not like having a conversation over the dinner table. And it was the two of us. I mean, but I think anyone who does oral history, it's a very intimate process, especially if you want them. You're handling something precious. And so I hadn't done, because dead people, 19th century. I hadn't done many oral histories in my life, but I had worked with, I had co-led workshops with someone who is much more experienced in this. And I think my friend Susan Ashmore, who's an extraordinary historian and does wonderful oral histories, and I think through her and through others, picked up this real respect you have to have when you're asking people about the intimacies of their lives, even if it doesn't seem intimate to you, and the gratitude that you need to have. So I think there's still a little bit of bringing that in. I will say, though, the outcome of my oral history with my dad is that we went to California together on a trip, and I don't think I told him this, but his brother lives there, and we also got to spend probably the most time I spent with the two of them together. And so they were in the front, two brothers driving. I was in the back like I was 10. And I just got to watch them interact, and it was really beautiful. I mean, I think my dad is watching. I've never told him this before, but I came back after that trip with them and was really often moved to tears thinking about it. I mean, it was a really incredible moment. So for that, it was different.
Right.
That was very different. I don't think I would have the same thing with other kinds of interviews.
Right. It opens the space for a very different conversation, probably, than you would have sitting at the dinner table, or right, to walk in with a list of questions. Right. It is a completely kind of different ritual, yeah?
It's definitely a different ritual, and yet it's personal. Now, I can also imagine, I'm sure, that there might be things that, in certain family situations, the family member doesn't want to share or doesn't think it's the right time to share. I know that that's a possibility, but
Right.
that hasn't been the case so far.
Right, right. So as you've been doing this work now, do you think differently about the relationship between maybe capital H historians and genealogists, or do you think differently about what research that we think of as genealogy research can bring to our work? I'm wondering if you've had an evolution in your thinking on that as you've worked on your family history.
The first thing I learned very early on is how much research, how much genealogists know about professional historians, even if we don't know much about them. And I mean that with true respect. Like, I would go to a couple of times, not because of the work I was doing, but because I was an historian. I was invited to genealogical workshops to talk about, say, in New York. And, or in Georgia, sometimes I went to a couple of conferences or workshops, and people are reading our work. They have great questions, and they are doing the kind of research that any academic historian would be envious to have the time to do. The other thing I would say, too, is that, and this is becoming more and more clear even this year, there have been a couple of moments in the last year where individuals have been focused on in African American history, and there's a way that you can dive in deep to that history when you're focusing on one person or one family. And one of the best books like this is Carla Peterson's book on her family in New York, Black Gotham, where she is descended of some 19th century African Americans. And so she did all of this incredible genealogical work. But even so, I wrote this first book that's about New York. It's like, 200 years of history, blah, blah, blah. And so it's this broad brush, and there are lots of little characters in there. But then what if someone takes one of those people and really figures out how they're connected to each other and what their lifespan is, and really sees that history through their lives? It's really compelling, and it does. It deepens the texture of the history that we know. And I've really been appreciative of that.
I think, I don't know if you would agree with this. I think maybe a generation ago there was there's always anxiety among historians, but there's anxiety among historians of if we were to do something like that, we would have to say, well, this is a case study, but it illuminates much, much broader themes, right? As if we were apologizing for the fact of doing something that we would think of as a microhistory or as an individual family's history. Yeah. Do you think we've moved beyond that and become less apologetic for this kind of work?
It'll be an interesting question. So I'll say that there are now a lot of historians who are doing work on their families. I went to a conference right before the pandemic, convened by Stefan Gerson at NYU, a French historian called Scholars and Their Kin. And these were, 20 historians who from all different countries, chronologies, thinking about their family history, many of them with themselves as part of it. It'll be interesting to see what the response to that is. I think that there is, and they were only the tip of the iceberg, as it turns out. It seems like I'm seeing more and more people from all walks of history, life, doing this. Right. I think that it's a different kind of writing. I mean, for me, it's a different kind of writing. It allows me to be more creative in my writing. And as someone who came to history wanting to be a writer, I think it presents these really interesting writing challenges of narrative, of how do you depict things in a different way. And frankly, I include the memoir and the family history because I thought that it would be, there's always a memoir boom. My whole life, it seems, has been about, memoirs more and more. And I thought it would be a way to get people interested in the history by going through individual lives. But I think that my ideas about that have deepened over time, that there really is research that I can do. A colleague of mine once said, you have to think of yourself as the archive. And I was like, really?
Yeah.
But he wasn't wrong. He's not wrong. And so really thinking of my experiences, my family experiences, looking at my diaries, looking at yearbooks, really trying to figure out. And I don't stop there. I then try to expand out and contextualize with the other tools I have as an historian.
Well, I'm glad you brought up thinking of yourself as the archive, because you've also written really compellingly about the limits of knowing and understanding of archival sources, specifically in relationship to African American history. And that, it seems to me that that's changed over the course of your career. You had some defining experiences early in your career, right, as a young African American historian approaching an archive.
Right.
I wonder if you'd be willing to share some of those, and then think about how or tell us about how your relationship to the archive has changed over time.
Well, I think early on, and I don't want to, there were archives that I went into that didn't feel friendly to me or to African American history. And I'll say maybe the kind way, the politic way to talk about it, although I've written about this with Dinah, but is that they didn't necessarily know what they had or how it might relate to African American history. There, of course, are longer histories of not seeing Black scholars and the questions they ask as important to what's in any archival collection. I'm sure this institution has had similar issues. This is not anything new. And I'll layer on to that, too, that there's also been a sea change in how institutions like the Newberry, how archives think of access to materials. When I was at Emory between, say, the mid-90s till practically yesterday, for 20 years, that was the first special collections where I felt that the archivists really wanted you to come in and touch things. And it was amazing to me. They really wanted to partner with scholars. I would say that that is more and more standard practice in a way that was not true when I started. So that's one layer. The other thing, though, is that so there opens up, I think, in African American history in particular, an opportunity, and there are archives who have taken this opportunity, which is to really reread the archive for African American history. And you could do this for other histories as well. But the thing that happens in archives is that even the librarians in archives, the archivists, really get to know a collection when someone uses it. And so as we continue to go in and ask questions, you learn, the people on staff as well as the historians and other researchers learn what's in that archive. And I think that's more and more accepted now. So there's the article that I wrote with Dinah, one of the things I said is that there's this constant, like, the lack of the archive, the silence in the archive. I wrote this whole book, it's 300 pages, but the archives were meager, and I don't want to hear it anymore. I think that we are backing ourselves into a corner when in fact the histories that I'm seeing produced are so much richer than they used to be. I mean, people have found incredible materials and have developed incredible methods of analyzing them. And I think we need to give ourselves a little more credit for doing that hard work. And also think about, how do we tell the stories we want to tell? And I think we need to, well, I don't want to say, well, I'll say it. I think we need to lean into that
Yeah.
a little more.
Well, you just mentioned archival silences, and it might be a term that some people watching are not as familiar with. I mean, what does that mean to say that there's a silence in the archive?
So often, we imagine archives, and we're not always wrong, but as places where working class people, enslaved people, people outside of the literate letter writing elite, that they left no trace, or their voices are not there. Just to give one example of a source where we might find their voices, even though it might be muddy, legal records.
Sure.
If you look at legal records and who's going to court, everybody's there.
Right.
A lot of different kinds of people are there. So that's one way in. Another way in might be reading the records of Thomas Jefferson or of any slave owner you want to mention, And everything from so-and-so was sick today, so-and-so came to me and said this happened, to so-and-so said to tell you hello, or so-and-so said, would you tell their family member who's with you and not with me hello? We really have to look for those moments and think about what they mean. And I want to add too that we have letters written by enslaved people. Um, I, one of the many, probably the best collection I can give you an idea of just how incredible the resource base for African American history can be, is on John Blassingame's Slave Testimony. It's like an 800-page book. It's a sampling of the kinds of testimony that enslaved people left. They are talking, they are not silent. So I feel that we, yes, there are silences in the archives, but that's true for everyone. That is true for every person. I think it's true that Thomas Jefferson never mentioned Sally Hemings, but she existed. So everybody has silences, and the question for historians is how do we work with that, work around that, find other ways to get what we need.
And how, in writing this book on New Orleans, do you think you will deal with that maybe at that moment where you do run into a wall of what is knowable or documented? It's in writing with Dinah Barry, your writing partner, who you've mentioned a couple times. You cite this ideal of what Saadia Hartman calls critical fabulation, that she put forward, about 15 years ago. I wonder, first, if you can tell us what that means, critical fabulation means, because it might be something that would make historians uncomfortable. But you find it appealing, so I'm curious about why you find it appealing.
So Saadia Hartman talks about this critical fabulation, which is there are these gaps in the archives, and we have to think about critically, we have to think about, well, if there were something there, if this person were there, what might have happened? And I say that historians have always done this, for better or for worse. We have always had to bridge the gap. And I'll say, sometimes we imagine the 20th century has more sources. Well, the 20th century has the opposite problem from the 19th century. The 19th century, there are clear gaps, the newspaper burned, the church burned down, those records disappeared, blah. The 20th century, you have so much material, you can't possibly read it all. So you too, you are making the gaps because you know that you're not going to read the 50,000 million pages of whatever it is. So we read enough, and we read other historians to try and make our best guess of what happened. And that act of creative interpretation, that act, not as a novelist would, but as an historian who has studied what is available, who has studied other historians, who has looked at comparable cities, comparable people, and from what they have, says, well, I think when I take the weight of all of that, I'm going to land on this side of what happened to this person.
Is it that there's more transparency in the way we write now
Yes.
about the fact that we are doing that?
So if I'll go back,
that would have been hidden when you say we've been doing this.
Yes.
2 generations ago, historians would have said, no, we're not doing that, right? Or would they? Am I wrong about that?
Well, some might not have been. Some might not. Some might have had a book. The topic is fully, the sources are fully available. They don't need to bridge. But I think that, I do think that there is a change in style, the sort of omniscient narrator style, very much your high school textbook style. Not always. I mean, there's some beautiful writers, don't get me wrong. But, this idea that I am presenting you everything. I think that we are more willing to say, that I'm going to take a leap here. And some people really hate that style of writing. This could have happened, or this could have happened, or this could have happened. But frankly, for other people, it's very exciting to think about the possibilities. And it can also be exciting to teach, because then your students go, well, why are they saying that? And you say, well, here's the document they started with. This is one source. Here are the books they read. And here's why they're not sure if they can make a hard case about what happened in this instance. So I think that certain histories sometimes call for that more than other histories, and we're seeing more of those kinds of histories being written. Again, non-elites, although I would say with some of the elites, we still have to make these kinds of educated guesses, is another way, I guess, to say it. That's a phrase I haven't used, but.
Right, and the historian is there in the narrative in a way saying, I am interpreting, right?
Yes.
So I wonder if if that will be true for your New Orleans book, does objectivity fit into your thinking as you write a family history? And how if so, how?
Yeah, I've been, I definitely thought about that early on, and continue to think about it. And again, as I continue. So on the one hand, what do I want to say? So I am in the book. My family and I went through some things. I'm sure my view of them is different than if they wrote the book. So I try, when I teach, I try to tell my students, let's put objectivity here. Let's think instead about point of view. So every historian you will read, every textbook you have, has a point of view. There is someone who thinks that this set of materials, facts, ideas, whatever, are the most important. There are some places where a large, 90% or more group of historians agree on that importance. But all of these our books, articles are written with a point of view. And so for me, for this book, I've become more and more clear that this is going to be from my point of view, not only about my family and I, but also about the history of the city, about what's important in that history. In terms of my family history, what's been so interesting to me is, and here I'm thinking more than 19th century, but even more contemporary. I'm more just curious. I don't have a lot of, I don't feel like I have a large stake in whether it went this way or that way, if that makes sense.
Are there any things you've learned that you, not to tell me what they are, but to feel that you feel like, well, I just can't include that. I just can't tell that.
Well,
Are there limits?
No, I will say that I've become more clear of my responsibility to tell my story and not tell someone else's story. Does that make sense? So before the book is published, I'm going to have my immediate family read it, and not as a veto. They're hearing this for the first time. But to make sure that I haven't talked about something that's not mine to talk about, not mine to disclose. I mean, again, you could even do an oral history as a professional historian, and then someone say, I told you all these things, but I would really appreciate it if you held this part back, or if you put the oral history on ice for 50 years, or whatever it is. So I feel like I have a responsibility for that. Does that make sense?
It does, although I've been told certain things in oral histories as well, and someone says, well, I wish you wouldn't use that, but
then you use it.
They've
signed away.
No, not that I wonder, are they telling because they want it to be used, right? And they want part of the story to be saying, please don't use that.
Oh, well.
I had a little of that. Anyway,
we'll talk more.
That's a tangent.
Clearly, I'm going to need your advice.
Yeah, no, that's a different kind of tangent. Okay. So when you dig in so deeply to this family history, and you said your family's going to read it first, right? They're gonna. I would think, or do you think they're going to read it differently, and then than the public who will buy it at the Newberry bookstore, right? And then do you think differently about what you want a takeaway to be for your own family versus a quote general reader, whatever that general reader might be?
I think there's a more personal takeaway for my family, and I can't prejudge what that will be, so that will work into our relationships the way that it does.
Do you have in mind what you want it to be as you're writing?
I think the only thing that I can say is that this book has taken me a very long time to write and a lot of therapy, and that's probably really good. I think I've become more compassionate to who we were in 2005, if that makes sense.
Who
And
we were, who's
like
the we? Your family
my
or people in
family,
New
my
Orleans?
family,
Oh, your family.
the people in
Okay.
New Orleans know. I mean,
Okay.
like politicians, no. I am not compassionate at all. But in terms of my family and the stress of that and how crazy it was, and you know, I think so. I think I've mellowed, and we'll see if they think so when they read it. But
Yeah.
so I feel like that. I feel like I have an arc in the book about that, and I think that I hope that that'll connect. It's just one of those normal family things that, in an extraordinary moment, happens. You know, where you just keep growing with your family. So there's a way in which I think what I'm talking about in the book is not the family of now, it's the family of then. So it has its own history too, right? It's in the past. But I'm not sure. I go back, when I think about people reading it, I go back to why I originally started writing it, was that I want people to really think deeply. Well, when I started writing it, I wanted people to think more deeply and more complexly about what was happening during and after Hurricane Katrina. What does it mean to call American citizens refugees? What does it mean to look at a city with so much history that had been majority Black in the 19th century and was majority Black now, and its wealth came from that, and then to just be disdainful of all that those people had contributed. And so I wanted to bring a more complex understanding of that history to bear on any conversation we would have about New Orleans. Unfortunately, at this time in history, with an even fuller sense of climate change, the question I think that I'm ending the book with is, what will it mean for a nation to lose a city? And New Orleans is one, but I was listening to reports from a state senator from New York. There's Miami. There's the whole West Coast. I mean, we really are, and there are nations. I mean, there was the man at the UN who is standing on his island up to his knees in water. So I think beyond my personal, my family, our lives, we are looking at a moment when we've already lived through several years of incredible change with the pandemic, but we are also in this moment when we're just going to start losing places that we had imagined as stable, whether we love them or not. So that's, I think, how do you live through that? I frankly hope I don't live through it. I don't want to be here to live through it, but I'm saying that that's where we are.
Well, it's a really powerful question just about human understanding, right? About humanity in this notion of being on the precipice of something that we assume may happen, and then how would you describe it, or how do you describe it? Living in denial about the fact that it will happen, or that we have to address it?
A couple of things. I mean, there's certainly denial, no question. And I have to go find this, but I remember listening into a conversation with neurologists that we are actually supposedly neurologically unable to plan far enough in advance to save ourselves. Sorry, I'm a fun person, especially if I've never had a future. Anyway, so
invite Leslie to your next party. Yeah,
you'll be in laughs and tears until the end. But the other is. And actually, I'm kind of putting this together now. You know, soon after Katrina, I had several conversations. Why would anyone live there? Should the city be saved? They should just turn it into the Alamo. Like, these are people talking to me, somebody with family, memories, life in that city, saying, we should just let it go. So, yes and no to, it's okay that those places vanish.
Right. Do you think we comfort ourselves with trying to say, well, that was an anomaly?
Yes.
Originally. Do you deal with it? And then so do you take that up in the book? Do you see that in your own family history?
For me, New Orleans and New York, especially in the 19th century, but definitely in the 19th century, are really, New Orleans is the economic capital here, in the South, and New York, there. And so these are two incredibly wealthy, incredibly economically important cities. And one went one way, right? Even down to the 70s and white flight. New York was horrible in the 70s, but turned it around, Wall Street, all those things, and New Orleans kept going the other way. Forget it. Forget. We as a nation can forget. It is only a place to go and have fun, like that film. And so, but the thing with climate change is that that's everybody. I mean, I've heard that, I'm not sure the timeline, but everything east of I-95 will be gone. So we can comfort ourselves for a little while, but this is not a change that is only for the places you don't like or think are not important.
Right, right. All right, on that note, let's turn to some questions from the audience. So you've touched on this a little bit, but this questioner is asking it more directly. As an academic historian, do you find pushback, criticism on your use of your own personal narrative and family archive in your writings? What advice can you give to those of us who wish to make our personal urban history known, but are not recognized in the academic world?
So on the first part, definitely when I started, and I started, well, you can do the math, 2006 to today. It's been a long time.
A little bit.
A little bit, yeah. So I definitely, when I started this project, a lot of people were like, "You're doing what? What is that? What does that mean? How is it?" And I think because it seems like it was in the memoir slot, it didn't make sense. And frankly, it didn't make sense to me. I think I felt a little guilty doing it. What was the second part of the question?
What advice can you give to those who wish to make our personal urban history known but are not recognized in the academic world?
Oh, just like out in the free world without my restrictions as an academic historian, have at it, join us, do it. No, because it really, I mean, again, I want to emphasize again that like as a writer, like be creative, try all the things. I mean, I think that's the one thing sometimes that academics, we do all this work, those of us who are fortunate enough to be on tenure track to get tenure, and then you're supposed to be able to be creative, and then you still feel like you're doing these narrow things. So just do it. Yeah. Try it. Find your group, work with them, have your friends read it, go for it.
Okay, here's a compelling one. I'm intrigued with how you intend to frame your story with two climate disasters, Betsy and Katrina. Can you speak to the issue of environmental racism in the history of Black New Orleans in general and your family in particular?
Yeah, I mean, well, that's interesting that you put Betsy in climate disaster, and that's a great question, because there's this question of when do we realize that climate change has happened? And I think we're learning that some people knew, Exxon, long before we did. In terms of the broader question, too, of environmental racism, of course, Cancer Alley in Louisiana, the oil companies, the oil refineries, all of these things are part of a long history of environmental racism in lower Louisiana. And, I would layer in the class element as well, that these are poor people who are working in these places or living next to these places. I mean, some of the landscapes that you drive through are unbelievably horrible. And to imagine that people are living in areas where they are kept up all night by the glow of the refinery is just, it's unbelievable. So,
someone asks, have you heard conflicting stories from family members, and how do you approach conflicting stories from family members?
I have 3 younger sisters who I love very much, and we each have our own stories. Yeah.
So is it when you were talking about telling your own story?
So it'll be I'm very clear it'll be my story, and I think that's part of it. Yeah,
I mean, could the conflicting stories also become part of the narrative itself?
Might be. I don't think I have anything right now that's set up in that way. Okay. So, yeah.
So this questioner is asking specifically about genealogy, and they ask, genealogy is about drawing conclusions about identity and kinship based on evidence. how does that fit into a broader, more general practice of historical writing and of history? It's a tough one.
That's a very doctrinaire view of genealogy.
Yeah. Okay, say more
I mean,
about that.
that definition would fit in with 99% of academic historians, certainly. My very good friend and colleague Karen Wolf is writing a book about genealogy that will be out very soon, and I am looking forward to it because I think she's going to trouble the waters a little bit about genealogy as, you know, a straight line, as evidentially simple. Like what do you decide is the right evidence? You have a family Bible, you have the biblical, the Catholic Church's baptismal records, and then you have the story told by your great grandmother plus the way you look.
Right.
And the Catholic Church didn't want to acknowledge the white father, so there's only somebody else there. And the family Bible, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
I mean, those are 3 documents that are giving you some information. You have to figure out which one you're going to follow, just as one example.
Someone wants to hear more about, it's kind of a writerly question. How are you going to organize the book? Are you starting with the aftermath of the hurricane? And if you do that, how do you get to the 19th century?
Thank you. That's a great question. So this is the funny thing to me. So as an historian, my book on New York is like 1626 to 1863. And in writing that book, I really was like, oh, chronology can sometimes explain things. Like I really remember that moment when I realized that if I looked at the order in which some things happened, it helped me work out writing problems. This book, the spine of it is Katrina, but around that, it's more topical, driven by the events of Katrina, and it's not linear. And so when I envisioned it, when I thought about it, it's like layers that by the end of the book, you have the image, but it's made of all these layers. So it's kind of a visual sense of what it is. So it's not linear, it's not completely linear. It's that the relevant history comes in when it helps explain something I'm going through or my family is going through in that moment. So for example, now I'm working on chapter 5, but that is the chapter where I'm starting to work out what Creole meant in the 19th century, even though it's far in the book.
Someone asks about doing oral history or interviewing family members, and I don't know if you want to answer this one, but what are the top 3 questions that you would recommend everyone asks their ancestors?
Oh.
Never thought about it that way.
I've never thought about it that
tough.
way either.
Yeah. Or
Tough.
are there questions, maybe another way to think of it is, are there questions you find yourself coming back to and asking multiple family members? Have you?
Not that, but you know, so I'm not a good family historian. I probably should have led with that. So I really have a hard time holding on to like who's descendant of who, like those family trees. I just can't, cousin of somebody. So, you know, when I start with my dad, I was like, okay, remind me, who are the names of everybody? And like I did the really basic stuff and then let myself be guided by what he had to say. And so we ended up in places that I totally didn't expect, and then we ended up in California. So, I think it really depends on what you're seeking in your family history. So if you don't know anything going in, then you have to really start with who are the names of your grandparents, your great-grandparents. You have to make sure you have a sense of where everyone was, where they came from, they moved from here to here.
Right.
Yeah, I think it's really individual.
Well, there's so many good questions we didn't get to, but I do want to come back on the last one. I mean, you've got to tell us about the youngest certified genealogist in California, right?
Oh
and
my
give us
gosh.
that.
Yes,
Why don't we close with
Absolutely.
a tribute to him? If you can tell us that story.
So Alex is my first ever meeting a history phenom at the age of, so he, in Sacramento, my father's side of the family, he was asking his mom about family history, and she was like, I don't know anything. He's like, well, I'm going to find out. And he took himself down to the archives, and he is incredible. he remembers all those connections. He knows who's related to who. He did it professionally for a little while. He understands the history. He's reading at 2 a.m. because he's young. But he really, we did a research trip together. I've learned a ton from him. I mean, he is so energetic and amazing. So we've had a great time. He's visited New Orleans. He's met my family. He's like the little brother I never had, and he's amazing. He's finishing up at UC Berkeley, hopefully, his history degree.
Is he a character in the book? And I guess that speaks to the question of is your process of knowing and coming to know what you know part of the narrative?
I think I think so, but I'm not sure. It depends on how much I'm staying in the Katrina years, because I meet him quite a bit later, I think in the 2010. And the Katrina spine is more 2005 to 2007, but it depends. I don't know yet, actually.
Unfortunately, we have to leave it there, but everyone, please join me in thanking Leslie M. Harris for being with us this evening.